United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres has sent a sharply worded letter urging Israel to reverse measures targeting the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. In a January 8th letter to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, seen by Reuters, Guterres said he could seek an International Court of Justice opinion if Israel does not reverse the measures against UNRWA. The Secretary-General stated that the United Nations cannot remain indifferent to actions taken by Israel, which are in direct contravention of the obligations of Israel under international law. They must be reversed without delay. The letter marks a significant intensification of the dispute between Israel and the UN leadership over UNRWA. Guterres' warning comes after Israel passed laws banning UNRWA from operating in Israel and restricting support to its facilities, and authorities seized UNRWA's East Jerusalem offices, according to Reuters. Israel's parliament passed legislation in October 2024 banning UNRWA from operating in Israel and limiting official contact with the agency. The law bars UNRWA activity in Israel and restricts official engagement, which UN officials say disrupts access and operations in areas under Israeli authority, including East Jerusalem. The legislation marked a dramatic escalation in Israel's long-standing criticism of UNRWA, which Israeli officials have accused of harboring militants and perpetuating rather than resolving the Palestinian refugee issue. For UNRWA, which has operated in the region since 1949, the legislation represented an existential threat to its mission of providing aid, health care, and education to millions of Palestinian refugees. Israel didn't stop with the October legislation. Lawmakers later expanded restrictions to allow cutting electricity or water to UNRWA facilities, according to Reuters. UN officials warned the utility restrictions could severely hinder UNRWA's ability to function. The amendment demonstrated Israel's determination to limit UNRWA's presence and operations in areas under its control. In addition to legislative measures, Israeli authorities seized UNRWA's East Jerusalem offices, Reuters reported. The seizure crystallizes a fundamental disagreement about Jerusalem's legal status. The United Nations considers East Jerusalem occupied Palestinian territory captured by Israel in the 1967 war. Israel considers all of Jerusalem, including the eastern part, to be part of its sovereign territory. This disagreement determines whether Israel has the legal right to take control of UN property or whether such seizure may conflict with international protections for UN facilities. Guterres' January 8th letter to Netanyahu employed unusually direct language for diplomatic correspondence between a UN Secretary-General and a member state. The Secretary-General stated explicitly that the UN cannot remain indifferent to Israeli actions. This phrasing suggests that silence or inaction would make the UN complicit in what it views as violations of international law. Guterres characterized Israeli measures as being in direct contravention of the obligations of Israel under international law, leaving no ambiguity about his legal assessment of Israeli actions. The Secretary-General's demand that these actions must be reversed without delay set a clear expectation, though the letter didn't specify a concrete deadline. Guterres' warning to potentially seek an International Court of Justice opinion represents a significant diplomatic tool. The ICJ, also known as the World Court, is the United Nations' highest legal body. It settles legal disputes between states and gives advisory opinions on legal questions referred by authorized UN bodies. If the UN follows up, it could seek an ICJ advisory opinion through UN bodies authorized to request it, such as the General Assembly, as has happened before on issues related to Israel and the occupied territories. However, there's an important limitation. ICJ advisory opinions carry legal and political weight internationally, but are not binding. The court has no enforcement mechanism to compel compliance. A critical ICJ advisory opinion could add diplomatic pressure, though it would not be legally binding. Israel's UN Ambassador Danny Danon responded swiftly to Guterres' letter. "We are not fazed by the Secretary-General's threats," Danon stated, dismissing the warning. Danon reframed the issue from one of international law compliance to one of counterterrorism. Instead of dealing with the undeniable involvement of UNRWA personnel in terrorism, the Secretary-General chooses to threaten Israel. The ambassador characterized Guterres' action as defending terrorism rather than international law. This is not defending international law. This is defending an organization marred by terrorism. Israel's UN envoy rejected the warning and defended the measures, framing them as a response to alleged UNRWA links to terrorism. To understand the significance of this confrontation, context about UNRWA is essential. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees was created by the UN General Assembly in 1949 following the war surrounding Israel's founding. During that war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees, displaced from areas that became part of Israel. UNRWA was established as a temporary agency to provide relief until the refugee issue could be permanently resolved through peace negotiations. 75 years later, UNRWA continues to operate because no permanent resolution has been achieved. UNRWA provides aid, health, and education services to millions of Palestinians across Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, according to Reuters and UNRWA. UNRWA is a central pillar of aid delivery in Gaza, and UN officials describe it as the backbone of the humanitarian response. The agency operates schools educating hundreds of thousands of children, clinics providing primary health care, and distribution centers delivering food assistance across the territories where it operates. In the West Bank, UNRWA serves registered refugees through schools, health centers, and social services. Beyond the Palestinian territories, UNRWA operates extensive programs in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, where large Palestinian refugee populations have lived for decades. For millions of Palestinians, UNRWA isn't merely one aid provider among many. It's often the only source of education, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance available. Israel has criticized UNRWA for decades, but the nature of those criticisms has evolved. Historically, Israel argued that UNRWA perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem by maintaining refugee status across generations rather than facilitating permanent resettlement. More recently, Israeli criticism has focused on allegations that UNRWA facilities are used by militants and that UNRWA staff includes Hamas members and supporters. These allegations intensified dramatically after the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, when Israeli intelligence claimed UNRWA staff participated in the assault. The October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on southern Israel killed approximately 1,200 people and resulted in about 250 hostages being taken to Gaza. The assault triggered Israel's military campaign in Gaza and fundamentally altered Israeli attitudes toward any Palestinian institutions, including UNRWA. Israel alleged that UNRWA staff participated in the October 7th attack and that agency facilities were used in planning or executing the assault. These allegations, if true, would represent an extraordinary violation of humanitarian principles and UN neutrality. UNRWA staff are supposed to be neutral humanitarian workers, not participants in armed conflict. The United Nations took the terrorism allegations seriously and acted to investigate. The UN announced that 9 UNRWA staff members may have been involved in the October 7th attack based on investigations conducted. These individuals were terminated from employment with the agency, according to Reuters. Additionally, a Hamas commander in Lebanon who was killed by Israel in September was found to have had a UNRWA job, raising questions about UNRWA's vetting procedures. However, the UN has emphasized important qualifications. The UN has vowed to investigate all accusations made and has repeatedly asked Israel for evidence, which it says has not been provided, according to Reuters. A significant point of contention is the adequacy of evidence Israel has provided to support its allegations. Israel claims it has extensive intelligence demonstrating UNRWA's infiltration by Hamas and other militant groups. Israeli officials describe this intelligence as comprehensive and damning. The UN responds that while Israel has made serious allegations, it has not provided sufficient documented evidence that would allow independent verification and further investigation. This creates an impasse. Israel argues the UN is willfully blind to UNRWA's problems. The UN argues it cannot take drastic action based solely on Israeli intelligence claims without corroborating evidence it can examine. Setting aside the terrorism allegations, UNRWA's operational importance in Gaza is undeniable. The war between Israel and Hamas has created what the UN Security Council and top humanitarian officials describe as a catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Gaza health authorities report tens of thousands killed, and UN officials describe the situation as a humanitarian catastrophe. The vast majority of Gaza's residents have been displaced, many multiple times. Civilian infrastructure has been extensively damaged or destroyed. In this context, UN officials and the Security Council have declared UNRWA the backbone of the humanitarian aid response in Gaza. The agency's extensive infrastructure, local knowledge, and experienced staff make it uniquely positioned to deliver aid at scale. Dismantling UNRWA would eliminate the primary mechanism through which humanitarian assistance reaches Gaza's population, potentially causing humanitarian collapse, according to UN officials. The International Court of Justice has already weighed in on Israel's obligations in Gaza. The ICJ has said Israel must ensure civilians' basic needs in Gaza and support UN relief efforts, including UNRWA. While ICJ advisory opinions are not binding and the court has no enforcement power, they carry significant legal and political weight. UN officials argue the measures against UNRWA may conflict with Israel's international obligations, and they cite UN protections for UN property and operations. Israel's legal obligations toward Gaza are a matter of ongoing dispute. The UN and many legal observers treat Israel as having obligations tied to effective control over Gaza's access points. Israel disputes that characterization, arguing it is not the occupying power since it withdrew its permanent military presence in 2005, and Hamas has governed the territory since 2007. As an occupying power under international law, a state has obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention to ensure the welfare of the occupied population, including adequate food, water, and medical care. This legal disagreement shapes how different parties interpret Israel's responsibilities toward Gaza's civilian population. The seizure of UNRWA's East Jerusalem offices highlights fundamental disagreements about Jerusalem's status that go back decades. International consensus, reflected in UN resolutions, considers East Jerusalem occupied Palestinian territory that Israel captured during the 1967 Six-Day War. This status means Israel's presence there is considered a military occupation subject to international humanitarian law. Israel considers all of Jerusalem, both the western part that was part of Israel before 1967 and the eastern part captured in 1967, to be its eternal, undivided capital. Israel annexed East Jerusalem, though this annexation is not recognized by most countries or international bodies. The United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017 and moved its embassy there. But most countries maintain embassies in Tel Aviv pending final status negotiations on Jerusalem. The confrontation raises profound questions about UN member states' powers regarding UN agencies. Can a member state unilaterally ban a UN agency from operating within its borders or in territory it controls? Can a member state seize UN property and cut utilities to UN facilities? Such a broad ban on a UN agency's work is highly unusual and has drawn concern from UN officials and some allies. If Israel succeeds without meaningful consequences, it could embolden other states to target UN agencies whose work they oppose, whether human rights monitors, humanitarian organizations, or development agencies. U.S. policy will heavily shape what pressure is realistic at the UN, given Washington's Security Council veto power. The U.S. has historically vetoed Security Council resolutions critical of Israel, arguing they are one-sided or don't adequately address Israel's security concerns. This veto power effectively shields Israel from binding UN enforcement actions. However, even traditional U.S. support for Israel has nuances. The U.S. recognizes UNRWA's humanitarian importance and has been one of its largest funders historically, though funding has fluctuated based on domestic political considerations. European countries which provide substantial UNRWA funding face a particularly difficult position in this crisis. On one hand, European governments generally support Israel's security concerns and acknowledge that allegations of UNRWA staff involvement in terrorism must be taken seriously. On the other hand, European countries are deeply committed to humanitarian principles and recognize UNRWA's role in Gaza. They fear restricting UNRWA could worsen the humanitarian situation. Some European countries temporarily paused UNRWA funding after the October 7th allegations, but later resumed it after UN investigations and reforms. European diplomatic efforts may focus on finding compromise solutions that address Israeli security concerns while preserving UNRWA's humanitarian functions, though such compromises appear increasingly difficult to achieve. Netanyahu's government faces domestic political dynamics that make backing down difficult. Right-wing coalition partners demand aggressive action against UNRWA and would likely withdraw support if Netanyahu reversed course in response to UN pressure. Israeli public opinion, particularly since October 7th, strongly supports cracking down on any Palestinian institution suspected of links to terrorism, including UNRWA. Any perceived capitulation to UN threats would be portrayed by Netanyahu's political opponents as weakness, particularly challenging given the Prime Minister's domestic political situation, including corruption charges. Despite his direct language, Guterres faces significant limitations in enforcing compliance. The Secretary-General cannot compel member states to comply with international law without UN Security Council backing, and the United States traditionally shields Israel from punitive Security Council action through its veto power. An ICJ advisory opinion, while carrying moral and legal weight, would not be binding. Israel could decline to follow it, as it has with previous ICJ rulings. The UN has limited enforcement tools without Security Council backing, so the practical impact may depend on member state pressure. This confrontation crystallizes a broader tension in international relations and humanitarian law. How should the international community balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations? Who decides when an aid organization has become compromised by militant infiltration? What level of evidence is required before restricting a UN agency serving millions? Israel argues it cannot allow an organization it believes is infiltrated by terrorists to operate freely. The UN argues that proper accountability mechanisms exist, but cannot include eliminating humanitarian access to millions. Lost in diplomatic confrontations and legal debates are ordinary Palestinians who depend on UNRWA services. Students attending UNRWA schools and refugee camps across the Middle East face uncertain educational futures. Patients relying on UNRWA clinics for primary health care wonder where they'll receive medical care if services cease. UN officials warn that hunger and severe shortages are widespread in Gaza, with aid levels still far below what is needed. These civilians have no control over the political forces determining their fate. They're caught between Israeli security concerns, UN bureaucratic processes, and great power politics. Whatever one's position on the political and legal issues, the humanitarian impact of restricting UNRWA would be borne by millions of vulnerable people who had no part in the decisions that led to this crisis. As of January 14th, 2026, several scenarios could unfold. Scenario 1, Israel maintains its position. The UN seeks an ICJ advisory opinion through the General Assembly, and the court issues an opinion critical of Israeli actions. Israel declines to follow it. UNRWA operations in Israeli-controlled areas cease. Gaza's humanitarian situation deteriorates further. Scenario 2, Behind-the-scenes negotiations between the U.S., EU, and regional actors produce a face-saving compromise. Israel modifies but doesn't fully repeal anti-UNRWA measures. UNRWA continues limited operations under new restrictions. Scenario 3. International pressure leads Israel to reconsider. Israel allows UNRWA to resume some operations while implementing enhanced monitoring to address security concerns. Scenario 4. Complete impasse. UNRWA is effectively unable to operate in areas under Israeli control. Alternative humanitarian mechanisms prove insufficient. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza intensifies. This confrontation tests fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. The principle of distinction requires parties to conflict to distinguish between combatants and civilians, directing operations only against military objectives. The principle of proportionality prohibits attacks where expected civilian harm would be excessive relative to anticipated military advantage. The principle of precaution requires parties to take all feasible measures to minimize civilian harm. UN officials and humanitarian law observers argue that eliminating humanitarian infrastructure serving millions of civilians would raise serious concerns under these principles, regardless of concerns about militant infiltration. This confrontation has implications for the UN's credibility and effectiveness as an institution. If Guterres issues warnings that Israel simply declines to follow without consequence, it highlights the UN's limited power to enforce international law against major powers or their allies. If Guterres does not follow through on seeking ICJ review, it may undermine his authority and the UN's ability to hold member states accountable. This dynamic isn't unique to Israel. The UN faces similar challenges holding permanent Security Council members and their allies accountable across various issues worldwide. The critical question is timing. When might the UN act on Guterres' warning if Israel doesn't comply? The January 8th letter demanded action without delay, but didn't specify a deadline. This ambiguity leaves open whether Guterres expects compliance within days, weeks, or months. If Israel maintains its position, Guterres and UN member states face the decision of whether to pursue an ICJ advisory opinion or let the warning remain without follow-up. As of January 14, 2026, the situation remains in flux, with both sides apparently prepared to maintain their positions despite the escalating dispute. The world watches as fundamental questions are tested. Can humanitarian principles constrain actions states deem necessary for security? Can international law limit powerful states' freedom of action? Or does power ultimately trump legal obligations? When security concerns and humanitarian obligations conflict, which takes precedence? These questions don't have simple answers, but how they're resolved in the UNRWA case will shape international humanitarian operations and UN member state relations for years to come. The outcomes matter not just for Israel and Palestinians, but for the broader international system's capacity to uphold humanitarian principles, even when they prove inconvenient to powerful states' security objectives.